Hey students, this won't be the best video ever, but real quick, don't forget I shared this with you, some helpful links, and we got the lecture notes that we've used throughout the year on there, chapters 1 through 31. I've got a link to my main page of the YouTube channel where I make these, post these videos. Video here for reviewing every president's, the Gilder-Lehrman website, which is great, has videos on the 9 AP units, some PBS videos, some other helpful links, so check that out. But let's kind of keep going on here. We left off with Jimmy Carter. Just kind of get this done and posted today here. But Jimmy Carter, guys, oh, we already talked about Jimmy Carter. Yeah. So we're actually starting right here with the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And so, guys, the Equal Rights Amendment, this had been pushed by Alice Paul in the early 1920s, right after the suffrage 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. It was written in 1921, the Equal Rights Amendment, and brought before Congress in 1923 for the first time. You don't necessarily need to know that dates, but basically, no, it's as soon as the women's suffrage is passed nationwide with the 19th Amendment. Remember, some states had given women the right to vote well before the 19th Amendment. For example, Wyoming as early as 1969, Utah and 1869, and Utah as early as 1870, just for examples. But anyways, the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, so it passes Congress in 1972, just a couple years before Alice Paul dies here. And you can see she actually thinks it's likely to pass when she dies. It unfortunately won't for her, but you look at this, past Congress in 1972. There was a deadline of 1979. It gets extended in 1982, but it still falls 3 states short. And 35 states pass it. You need 38 to get to the 3/4 requirement. Michigan, our state, did end up passing it. Gerald R. Ford and both Jimmy Carter, the Republican president of the mid-70s there, from Watergate up to the 1977 when Jimmy Carter wins that 1976 election. Remember, if you win in November of 76, you don't take office till January of 77. But the big Republican and the big Democrat president of the 70s both supported it. And one of the reasons it doesn't get support, it looks like it would. I mean, the public polling at the time showed mass support. Both major political parties had it in their platform as supporting it. However, people start to worry about like the military draft. Oh, you just had the Vietnam, war kind of ending in the early mid 70s there, and do you really want it to, a lot of people felt, more willing for whatever reason to have their sons drafted than their daughters drafted, and if we treat women and men equally, and you have to treat them equally, well, that means your daughters will get drafted. People aren't as fine with that. That was one of the big reasons. Also, we had talked about this before, I believe, in class, but the Equal Rights Amendment technically would legalize gay marriage. Most Americans support that today. However, back then, it's a big, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world type scenario going on there. So the Equal Rights Amendment starts to lose some support, and it's the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan who requests the Republican Party to remove it from their platform. He's their candidate in 1980, and so it goes from both major parties supporting the Equal Rights Amendment to just one of the 2 major parties supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. Some other things kind of going on in this era. Roe v. Wade, very controversial Supreme Court case that people still have strong feelings for and against this court ruling here. I'm not going to tell you how to think. I'm just going to say people have strong feelings on both sides of the issues, and that's for you to make up your own mind, not for me to tell you. But basically, the Supreme Court ruling says that states can't ban abortion in the first trimester, and states can later on in the pregnancy. and states can regulate reasonably for paternal health reasons in the second trimester. So states could no longer just outright completely ban um, abortion access per this ruling here. Um, the gay liberation movement starts to pick up, especially here in the 70s. A lot of people would not make it public who they were, hide. And you start to see people talking about coming out with pride and accept, not just trying to have other people accept you for who you are, but you accepting yourself for who you are. And this really starts to take hold here in the 70s and the 80s. Ronald Reagan, nicknamed the Great Communicator, he had been a Hollywood actor before he got into politics, and he whether you like him or dislike him, he was gifted at speaking. He could do well in a debate. He could, give a good speech that would make people listen and make people think, and he really endeared himself to the majority of the American public. He wins re-election in 1984. So he wins in 1980, but he wins re-election in 1984. He wins re-election with 49 of 50 states. And part of it is this great communicator. People just, felt like a connection to him because of how well he was at speaking and, relating with people. Like I had just said, the Republican Party pulls their support for the ERA in 1980. But at the same time, Ronald Reagan promises to pick more women for positions than any president prior to him in U.S. history. And he did do that. And so like Sandra Day O'Connor was the first female Supreme Court justice, and she was picked by Ronald Reagan during this time period. And so the honest truth is, a lot of feminists back then, they had mixed feelings with Ronald Reagan, because in some cases they were very happy with him because he picked so many women for various government positions, and most notably Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to ever be on the Supreme Court. And at the same time, like, he would attack abortion verbally, and they wouldn't like that. But then he never actually moved any legislation against it. So, and he would say, well, like, America is not sexist. And whether you agree with him or not, a lot of feminists didn't like that. They were like, no, it is. And Reagan's like, no, it's not. Individuals can be, but America's not. And, and you could argue it's semantics back and forth there. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of feminists were, they had mixed feelings on him because they didn't like some of the stuff he was doing. But then at the same time, like, he promised to do this, picking more women into government position than any president ever before him, and he fulfilled it. So, so it's a mixed record there. He promises deregulation, which he is successful on it on several accounts. Deregulation, less government regulations, less government like red tape for businesses and things like that. And he pushes this theory called supply-side economics. It's oftentimes nicknamed Trickle-Down Economics. And he talks about lowering tax on people who supply things, people who produce things, and lowering taxes on investments. So you get more investments, you get more production out of people, and stuff like that is what he talks. He tries to lower barriers on people who produce goods, people who produce services. And he says this is going to have ripple effects throughout the economy. But not everyone agreed. In fact, his own vice president, when campaigning against him in the Republican primary, because Bush Sr. also wanted to run for president that year, didn't get it, but then ends up becoming the vice president on the second person on Reagan's ticket there. But he actually disagreed with this economics and called it, quote, voodoo economics. People still debate supply-side economics today, and some people argue, like the quantitative easing that we've seen the past decade and a half or so, is actually a variation of supply-side economics. So if you take that argument, we're still doing this form of trickle-down supply-side economics today, you could argue. But a lot of people felt like it left a lot of the poor behind, and focused more on the people who are already doing okay. I mean, if you're already producing things, you're probably already doing okay. And the lower income people, the people maybe struggling to maintain a job or find a job. A lot of people felt like those groups were kind of left behind. But the economy does start to pick up steam in the 80s here. Now, is it all Reagan's and 100% his credit? A lot of economists say, you can't completely discredit him, but you also have a lot of new technological advances. Just like in the 1990s, is 100% Clinton? Does he get all of the credit for the economic boom in the 90s? Or is it a lot of, technological advances just like the 80s? The 1990s is famous for having like the internet and other technological advances and so forth. But the economy does pick up steam. We drop the stagflation. Reagan quickly is able to help get inflation under control. They raise interest rates dramatically, which was unpopular, and a lot of people criticized it, but then it actually did stop inflation. And then eventually, they got inflation under control quickly, and then the stagnant economy took a couple of years longer, but eventually the economy starts to boom here in the 1980s. And the mid and late 80s into the 90s is known as this prosperous time. Reagan says, look, the economy is improving. We need to cut government spending and things like that. And the private sector is picking up steam, so we need to cut government spending. How are we going to do it? Let's cut food stamps, which a lot of Democrats are upset about. Student loans. Look, the college kids can go get their loans from a bank. The government doesn't need to be involved. A lot of Democrats upset with that. And then also cutting funding for mass transportation, like bus lines, or the government helping states or cities build subways or whatever. And a lot of Democrats were upset with that. So you can see, like, a lot of Democrats were a bit upset with them on some of these issues here. Air traffic controller strike. The air traffic controller, the air traffic controller union was called PATCO. And they go on strike. Legally, they were not allowed to strike. However, they were the only union in the U.S. to have endorsed Reagan in 1980. And so they thought they were safe. Like, we're legally not allowed to strike, but you know what? We publicly supported Reagan. Reagan's our guy. He'll be all right. He'll support us. And Reagan said, no, the law is you can't strike. You go to work or you're fired. And the union kind of called his bluff, and he fired them all. Anyone who was still striking was fired, and he replaces them. And you can't instantly replace the air traffic controllers. These are the people who man like the radars and tell planes when it's safe to land and take off at the airports. So he had the military come in and run the air traffic controlling jobs until they could be replaced. By the way, this is actually a high-paying job. I heard it's really stressful, but that's a high-paying job that you don't actually need a college degree for per se. You can get a college degree for it, but you don't technically need it. But SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the media nicknamed it Star Wars, like after that movie. But basically a missile defense system. And now this never actually becomes reality per se, but the idea is if somebody were to launch missiles at us, would have stuff in space that could shoot down the missiles. And some people say, well, this is smart, so it's defense, and you want to be able to shoot down incoming missiles in this age. But other people said, no, it's actually an escalation, because what we're telling the Russians is we're trying to be able to win a war where we can launch missiles at you. You can't shoot them down. You launch missiles back. We can shoot them down. And so some people saw this as a Cold War escalation. Some people said, no, it's just common sense. This is how it has to be. But it was very provocative and upsetting to the Russians. In fact, Reagan actually had a meeting with Gorbachev. And Reagan was trying to make the world outlaw nuclear weapons. The U.S. would get rid of nuclear weapons. The Soviets would get rid of nuclear weapons. And then would force all countries to get rid of nuclear weapons. And Reagan was this close to getting the Soviet Union to agree. The big holdup was Russia said you have to ditch your attempts to make a strategic defense initiative. And by the way, we never actually successfully made it. Reagan said, no, I campaigned so hard on this. The media's made such a big deal out of it. I can't give up this. And Russia's like, you have to. And then Reagan goes so far as to actually tell the Russians, if I'm successful with this, I'll give you the same technology so you can shoot down missiles too, but let's outlaw nuclear weapons. The Soviets say no. Reagan walks out of the meeting and says we were this close to banning nuclear weapons in the world. And it's kind of sad it didn't happen, to be honest. But anyways, Central America, this is kind of continuing a theme in U.S. history. Remember, Woodrow Wilson invades over half a dozen Latin American countries. Well, so does Ronald Reagan here. And then you got like William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy. You have, before that, you have Theodore Roosevelt doing things like with the Panama Canal, helping start a revolution in Colombia so Panama could break off and he could make the canal. You might remember FDR tried to kind of tone this down with the good neighbor policy. But guys, you know what? Oh my gosh. He invades or intervenes in 7 different countries in Latin America, oftentimes because the communists might take over the country or whatever. Lebanon, Libya, terrorist attack, kill U.S. Marines. This Iran-Contra affair becomes this huge scandal. It's the biggest scandal of the Reagan presidency. And it's a very complicated story. But so basically, we're not friends with Iran. But basically, some terrorists take U.S. hostages. And we technically don't negotiate with terrorists officially. We actually do. Historically, you can find examples all the time. But technically, we officially don't negotiate with terrorists. And the terrorists are trying to take U.S. hostages to get something out of us. But our official policy is we don't give out stuff, because the thought is if we give rewards to terrorists for taking U.S. hostages to release those hostages, then essentially it's going to encourage more terrorists to take more Americans hostage, and it's just not a good position to be in. Iran has connections, friendly connections to those terrorists. We're not necessarily friends with Iran, if you remember from all the previous lectures, but Iran wants weapons to fight Iraq. In the U.S., we make more weapons than anyone. So the U.S. secretly sells weapons, for money, sells weapons to Iran, which we technically weren't supposed to be doing, so they could fight Iraq, in exchange for Iran using their influence, because they're friends with the terrorists, to get the U.S. hostages free. So we basically sell weapons to Iran. Iran thanks us by telling the terrorists, hey, we support you, we've supplied you stuff, you got to free those hostages, or else you're going to lose our, what we've got going on together. And we have to hide this transaction, because technically we weren't supposed to be doing this, selling weapons to Iran. So we have to hide the transaction. So they funnel the money back to Nicaragua. Why are we funneling the money back to Nicaragua? Because the fact of the matter is, you have the Contras, and they're fighting the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas are communists trying to take over Nicaragua, and the Contras are people trying to prevent the communist Sandinistas from taking over Nicaragua. So you have what amounts to basically kind of like a civil war in Nicaragua, where we're funneling the weapon sales profits to Iran to the Contras. Now, why is this another problem here? Because technically we're not supposed to be aiding the Contras. Americans looked at Nicaragua. Should we help them stop the communist takeover? And America said no. Why? Well, we just fought a gosh darn war in the jungles of Vietnam, and it didn't go so well, because eventually, after we pulled out, we had a peace deal between North and South Vietnam, but then essentially as soon as the U.S. military left, North Vietnam attacked South Vietnam again. Eventually North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, the communists won. And people look at Nicaragua and they're like, oh my gosh, it's jungles. It looks like a mini Vietnam waiting to happen here. And so Congress passed this Boland Act, which says that we can't support the Contras fighting in Nicaragua against the communist Sandinistas. And so, to make a long story short, Reagan's violating the Boland Act and so forth. When this whole scandal comes out, Reagan apologizes. He says, I thought I didn't know anything about it, but I guess I do. I guess I did, because I was in on some of the meetings where this was going on. A lot of people laughed at him. Some people said he might have actually been telling the truth. Right or wrong, some people speculate that he did for a fact later have Alzheimer's, but some people speculate that maybe he was having it. But the fact of the matter is, the scandal didn't really hurt him, and it really should have, because Congress specifically passed unanimously this Boland Act telling Reagan you can't help the Contras, and then he does it anyways. And you get this nickname Teflon Ron because nothing sticks to Teflon. So like Ronald Reagan, Teflon Ron, that like you have this big scandal here potentially, and it doesn't stick to him. It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't really hurt him that much politically. Gorbachev is the Soviet Union leader that Reagan has good relations with. And Gorbachev does this perestroika and glasnost to open up society, restructure society, increase freedoms, specifically things like political freedoms in the Soviet Union. I remember even being a kid and seeing Pizza Hut commercials talking about how Gorbachev let in Pizza Hut into the Soviet Union, and that's kind of part of this whole opening up and restructuring of the Soviet Union society. Bush Sr., the vice president under Reagan, then becomes president. A lot of people say they vote for Bush Sr. because it's giving Reagan his quote third term, because it's the vice president under Reagan. He's famous for Desert Storm, forcing Iraq out of Kuwait when they took over Kuwait, and he goes to the United Nations to do it and gets the United Nations to agree to this, and we have this widespread coalition across the globe. He helps pass this Americans with Disabilities Act to try to make, for example, like public buildings more accessible to people who might have like a physical impediment or whatever, like wheelchair accessibility. It might be one example. What really does him is he says, read my lips, no new taxes, and he makes a big deal about how he's never going to raise taxes, but spending goes up, spending goes up, spending goes up, spending goes up. And he says we need to hold back on spending, but Congress says we need more spending, and he spends more. And then he's like, well, maybe we need more taxes to pay for it. And to make a long story short, the public is actually pretty bitter towards him when he raises taxes after promising so much. You can see my empty classroom there. Hopefully next week I'll have bright, cheery faces in here smiling or being put to sleep by me. But sorry about the quality of this lecture. But kids, have a good day. Stay out of trouble. Get some fresh air. Get some exercise. I'll hopefully see you all next week.